any questions of a halachic nature that you wish to begin with?
Yeah, Rabbi Fink, may I ask you a question?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, so my question is, according to Halacha, is there a concept for conscientious objection? For example, if I was a chayal today, I wouldn't want to be conscripted. But if Yehoshua bin Nun were the general, I would gladly be conscripted. But because I don't trust this government, I would want to be a conscientious objector. Ma halacha omer al zeh.
War divides into two categories. Some wars are milchemet mitzvah, a mitzvah to go to war, and in those cases, you really don't have a choice. Everyone has to do his or her part. On the other hand, there's also a milchemet reshus, an optional war, which the king, back in those days, the discussions were always about the king. The king decides he wants to go to war, but it's not something which is obligatory. Now, all of this has very little application to contemporary wars today. Contemporary wars today do not fit into the halachic categories, because halachic wars today are either wars of pikuach nefesh, defensive, or they're wars of conquest, offensive. Those are the only two kinds of wars that we have nowadays. And the question you ask, let me rephrase it in stronger terms. We're going to deal today with the mitzvah of Yeshivat Eretz, and we're going to learn that there's we'll learn the various opinions about the obligation of living in Israel, and following that, flowing out of that, the prohibition to leave Eretz Yisrael. So a stronger form of your question would be, is it halachically acceptable to flee, to run away from Eretz Yisrael in times of war because you are afraid of the war or something like that? So if we can get an answer to that question, then the answer to your more detailed question will be obvious. Well, to get to the answer, let's look at the sources. Any other questions we have to deal with first? Now, I know how to get the sources on the screen. I do share screen, and I look for the sources. Voila. Share. There we go. I did it. Wow. I'm so good. There are two principal opinions regarding the mitzvah of Yeshivat Eretz. First, we're going to see the Rambam, and then we'll see the Ramban. Those are the two principal opinions. And then we'll see what the contemporary poskim have to say about conclusions to draw from these ideas. First, the opinion of the Rambam. Asur latzet me'eretz Yisrael l'chutz la'aretz l'olam. One is never allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael to travel abroad. If you're here, you're stuck here. It's just prohibited to leave. Now, of course, Rambam doesn't mention here whether we're talking about a Torah prohibition or a rabbinic prohibition, but that's something we're going to have to clarify. But at the moment, we know there's at least some kind of prohibition to leave Eretz Yisrael. Ella, unless lilmod Torah, unless you're leaving Israel to study Torah. There's some famous yeshiva, some famous Rosh Yeshiva, some famous Rav, and you want to go study in that place in Chutz La'aretz. Oh, that's a heta. That's a justification for leaving Eretz Yisrael. Only Saisha, or if you want to get married. Everyone knows that not only the Rambam, but the whole of rabbinic literature is written from the masculine point of view. So, of course, marriage is referred to as traveling abroad to marry a woman. It's looking at it from the man's point of view. But well, of course, it's unthinkable that a woman would have written the Mishnah Torah. But I suppose a woman would formulate it just the other way around. In any event, the first two justifications for leaving Eretz Yisrael are so far: number one, to learn Torah; number two, to get married. Or number three, lahatzil mina akum. If you want to save your property, or if you want to save lives which are under threat in Chutz La'aretz, it's permissible, justified to leave Eretz Yisrael to save property which is in danger or lives which are in danger. Well, after you've accomplished your purpose of either learning Torah abroad or getting married abroad or saving the property or whatever it is you traveled abroad to save, once you've accomplished your mission, the justification for leaving Eretz Yisrael collapses because you've done what you wanted to do. Therefore, Yachzor La'aretz, therefore you have to go back to live in Israel. V'chein yotzei l'schora, and similarly, one is allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael for business purposes. One is allowed to leave for business purposes. That is, to make a livelihood, even though the Rambam doesn't say how much you're allowed to make in Chutz La'aretz. Any schora, any business in Chutz La'aretz is a justification for leaving, even if you have sufficient livelihood in Eretz Yisrael, but still you want to travel abroad for more or better livelihood. You're allowed to travel abroad for purposes of livelihood, even if it's not strictly speaking necessary. All this is just about traveling abroad briefly. Briefly might end up being a few years, but for a specific purpose. And when the purpose is accomplished, you come back to Eretz Yisrael. But living permanently outside of Eretz Yisrael is prohibited. The justifications for leaving justify only temporary leaving. The duration of time, which is temporary, is until you fulfilled the purpose which justified leaving Eretz Yisrael. Ela im kein chazak sham harav, unless, of course, there's famine in Israel. If there's famine, there's no food, well, then it's permissible to leave Eretz Yisrael and go to a place where there's food to eat. Famine, where people are starving in Israel, that justifies going to Chutz La'aretz. When the price of staples doubles, as the food supply declines, the prices go up, and when the prices have doubled, that's the geder, that's the indication that you're living in times of famine and one can travel abroad. When does this apply? All this assumes that people have money, but there's no foods to buy, and that's why the price of food rises so dramatically. But if the food is cheap, but the people have no money to buy it with, and they have no way to earn money, they don't have a penny left in their pockets. So famine is defined in two ways: either a general way, which pertains to the whole society. When the prices of foodstuffs doubles, then anyone who wishes to is allowed to leave Israel to find food abroad. And in a personal, individual way, if you are in financial trouble and cannot afford to buy food, avda pruta min hakis, you don't have a penny left in your pocket, then on an individual basis, for you, it is famine in Israel because you cannot afford food. Af al pisha mutar, let's say, and in all of these cases where it is permissible to leave Eretz Yisrael, ena midas chasidus, it would be an act of piety to remain in Eretz Yisrael. All these reasons justify leaving, but it would indeed be an act of piety to remain in Eretz Yisrael despite all the problems. Shnei Machlon v'Kilion Shnei Gedolei Ador Hayu. We know from the story of Ruth that Machlon and Kilion were two great figures. Mipnei Tzara Gedola Yatzu, and they had great tzarot and left Eretz Yisrael. And HaKadosh Baruch punished them, and they were ruined. Well, even when it's justified to leave Eretz Yisrael, it would be an act of piety. You have to decide yourself whether you want to be pious, chassid, above and beyond what halacha requires. It would be, and it's not foolish to remain in Israel. On the contrary, it's praiseworthy, an act of chassidus, an act of piety. Gedolei hachabim hayu menashkim tchumei Eretz Yisrael menashkim avaneim etgalgalim bafra. The great rabbis demonstrated their love of the physical attributes of Eretz Yisrael. Kach hu omer, that's what it says in Sefer Tehillim. Kiratzu avadecha et avaneya vet afra v'yacholenu. Living in Eretz Yisrael is an expression of the love of the physical place, Eretz Yisrael. Amru Chachamim, the rabbis teach us, Kol Shochein be'Eretz Yisrael avnotav mechulim. Living in Israel is so meritorious. The zchut is so great that your sins will be forgiven. As it says, as the Navi teaches us, Val Yoma Shachein Chalisia Am Hayoshev Banu Umavon. Living in Eretz Yisrael is enough to cancel, to eliminate your avon, the sins you've had. Afilu halach ba'arba amos, just walking 4 cubits. Like a cubit is the distance from elbow to the top of the finger. It's a standard measure, dependent upon your arm or my arm. But walking the short distance in Eretz Yisrael, if you do that, you merit living in the next world just because you were in Eretz Yisrael and walked a distance of 4 amot. That's how precious, how spiritually precious living in Eretz Yisrael is. Just getting buried in Eretz Yisrael, even if you die abroad, just getting buried in Eretz Yisrael. Ki'ilu hamakom shehu bo mizbach kapara. Getting buried in Israel is like offering a sacrifice on the Mizbeach in the Beit HaMikdash, as it says in the Pasuk, Kiper admato amo, being buried in the Adamah, being buried in the physical land of Eretz Yisrael grants kapara, atonement for your sins. B'poranutu omer, and the Navi says, Al Adamah tme'ah tamut, if you live on impure land, that means chutz la'aretz, well, you'll be spiritually dead. You experience spiritual death in chutz la'aretz. Therefore, la'olam yadur adam be'eretz Yisrael, you should always live in Israel. Afilu be'ir sheruba akum, even if you're in a place where the majority population are idolaters, still, it's Eretz Yisrael and worth it. Al yadua b'chutz la'aretz, you should never live abroad. Afilu be'ir sheruba Yisrael, even in a place where the majority population is Jewish and Torah observant. Better a non-Jewish environment in Eretz Yisrael than a Jewish environment abroad. Shekol hayotzei l'chutz la'aretz ki'ilu oved avodah zara. Leaving Eretz Yisrael to travel abroad, unless you have one of the justifications that we mentioned earlier, is tantamount to idolatry. And that's what it says in the Pasuk, Ki gershuni hayom mistapeach b'nachalat Hashem, when you're driven out of Eretz Yisrael, away from the Nahala, away from the inheritance of Hashem, that's like serving other gods. So it's really bad to leave Eretz Yisrael. It's really bad to live abroad. The Paranias Omer, Another pasuk says, "Be'el admat Yisrael lo yavo'u." Well, Kishem she'asur letzet me'eretz Yisrael lechutz la'aretz, kein asur letzet me'bavel l'shar aratzot. And the idea of the preciousness, the value, the extreme value of Eretz Yisrael when compared to chutz la'aretz is parallel to the value of living in Bavel, in Babylonia, compared to other places outside Babylonia. Now Babylonia is in a sense, so it's very fun. You know, the rabbis argue amongst themselves exactly where the gvulot, the borders of Eretz Yisrael are. But Bavel's pretty far. I mean, Babylonia is not Eretz Yisrael. That's obvious. But in those days, Babylonia, Bavel, the modern Iraq, in those days, it was a Makom Torah. In those days, it was the world center of Torah and yeshivas. Well, if you're there, don't go to France. If you're there, don't go to Kenya. If you're in Bavel, stay there. Going to someplace outside of Bavel is, well, not as bad as leaving Eretz Yisrael to go someplace else, but pretty bad also. Shne'amar, and that's what Yecheskel said in the pasuk. Bebela yovu shama yiyu ad makom paktiet otamnu mashem. The Jews should remain in Bavel, Elisim, Vashivotim, until such time as a Kodesh Baruch Hu brings them out of Bavel and brings them to Eretz Yisrael. So Eretz Yisrael and Bavel are the two special places on the face of the earth. Eretz Yisrael far more special. Back in those days, Babylonia was also special. That no longer applies. Now let's think about what the Rambam has taught us. Before we clarify his principal point, let me observe that the borders of Eretz Yisrael can be defined in two very different ways. One could look at the borders of Eretz Yisrael back in the days of David HaMelech, or one could look at the borders of Eretz Yisrael when Ezra and the Jewish people came back to Eretz Yisrael after the exile in Babylonia. The poskim call these two different ways of looking at the borders, the gvulot of Eretz Yisrael, gvulot olei Mitzrayim, the borders as the borders of Eretz Yisrael were in biblical days when the Jews came from Mitzrayim through the days of David HaMelech. And those are very different from the gvulot, very different from the borders of Eretz Yisrael in the Bayis Sheni, in the Second Temple period, after the Jews came back from Bavel. That's called Gvulot Olei Bavel, the borders of Eretz Yisrael after the Babylonian dispersion came back to Eretz Yisrael. Now, of the two ways of looking at the borders, Gvulot Olei Mitzrayim, the Gvulot of Eretz Yisrael back in the days of David HaMelech, Eretz Yisrael was much bigger. And in the days of Ezra, through the days of the Bayis Sheni, the Second Temple, after the end of the Babylonian dispersion, the Gvulot of Olei Bavel is a much smaller geographical place than in biblical days. Now, as far as these two ways of looking at the borders of Eretz Yisrael are concerned, the Mishnah and the Gemara make a point that call mitzvot haaretz, any of the mitzvot which are agricultural in nature, mitzvot haaretz, mitzvahs which depend upon the earth, upon the ground, agricultural mitzvot, shmita, trumot, maaserot, all of the agricultural mitzvahs, einan nohagot ele be'eretz Yisrael, those mitzvahs apply only in Eretz Yisrael and only within the borders of Olei Bavel, only within the smaller borders of where the Jews lived after coming back from Babylonia with Ezra through the Second Temple period, up to Churban Bayis Sheni. But all the other mitzvot of Eretz Yisrael, aside from the agricultural ones, they apply within the larger borders of Eretz Yisrael, within the borders of Olei Mitzrayim. I'll give you an example and you'll understand how it works. You already know that Trumot and Maserot and Shemitah and the agricultural mitzvahs are only within the borders of Olei Bavel. But let's look at another mitzvah. Smicha, rabbinical ordination. Smicha began with Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu passed Smicha, rabbinical ordination, onto Yehoshua, and through the generations, Smicha went from Rav to disciple through the generations. Now, there's this whole long list of requirements that must be fulfilled before you can get Smicha, rabbinic ordination, as it was in the old days. Among the many rules and regulations is you have to know Kol HaTorah Kula. The disciple has to know the whole of Torah, the whole of the length and breadth of Torah before the Talmud, before the disciple can receive ordination from his teacher. There are many other rules and regulations. Among the rules and regulations of giving smicha to the next generation is that both the masmich, the rabbi giving smicha, and the musmach, the disciple receiving the smicha, they must both be physically in Eretz Yisrael. It doesn't work outside of Eretz Yisrael. And as the Rambam says flat out in Hilchos Sanhedrin, in the Mishnah Torah, the masmich, the rabbi giving smicha, and the musmach, the disciple receiving smicha, have to be physically in Eretz Yisrael, not necessarily within the smaller borders of Olei Bavel. It also works within the larger borders of Olei Mitzrayim. Similarly, the mitzvah of Yishuv Haaretz that we're talking about today, the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael, is not of an agricultural nature. No one ever said that you have to be planted in the ground somehow physically. It's not an agricultural mitzvah, and therefore the mitzvah of Yishuv Haaretz applies within the larger borders of Olei Mitzrayim as they were back in the days of David HaMelech. That said, rabbis disagree about exactly where those borders are located, just like rabbis disagree exactly about where the borders were in the days of Bayat Sheni. Not only do rabbis argue about this, but archaeologists are very interested in it as well. Whenever they excavate an old synagogue in Beit Sha'an and find an old mosaic which mentions the different towns and villages near where the Beit Knesset, where they found this old mosaic, is, which locations have an obligation of Trumot and Maserot, and which locations do not have an obligation of Trumot and Maserot. So this interests archaeologists very intensely to try to figure out exactly where the borders, the halachic borders, were of Eretz Yisrael. Now, if you think about it for a moment, everything that I've said about the borders of Eretz Yisrael, whether it's the first set, as in the days of David HaMelech, or in the later set of borders, as in the days of Bayat Sheni, everything I've said about borders has to do with different mitzvot, where the mitzvot apply and where the mitzvot do not apply. This clearly has nothing to do with the political borders. The halachas are identical, whether it's a Jewish state in control of Eretz Yisrael, as in the days of Bayat Sheni, for example, or today, or it's the Turks who are in control, or the British, or the Romans. It really doesn't matter who has political control of Eretz Yisrael and what the political borders might be. The halachic borders, the concept of halachic borders is totally independent of that. Okay, all of this is background. Now, if you think for a moment about what the Rambam has taught us, you have to live in Eretz Yisrael. You're in general not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael unless you have one of these justifications, and then you can leave and come back. Or if you are living in poverty and don't have enough money to buy food, then you can travel abroad. The Rambam, beginning to end, is talking to individuals. He's not talking about an obligation of Am Yisrael, the Jewish people in general, to reside in Eretz Yisrael. He's talking about the obligations of each individual Jew. According to the Rambam, the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz is not a mitzvah which falls upon Am Yisrael as a whole. Rather, it's a mitzvah which falls upon each individual Jew. That is the underlying idea of the Rambam. Now, all of this creates one big conceptual problem. The one big conceptual problem that this creates is the Rambam seems not to have practiced what he preached. The Rambam seems to be speaking with a forked tongue. Behold, the Rambam says all these lovely things about how you have to live in Eretz Yisrael, not allowed to live anywhere else. Well, he lived in Spain. Then he fled Spain to North Africa during the period of the persecutions of the Almohadin in Spain. He fled to North Africa. From North Africa, he came to Eretz Yisrael briefly in Eretz Yisrael, and then he went to Egypt and spent around half his life in Egypt, in the old town of Fustat, the old town of Cairo. So the Rambam seems not to have practiced what he preached. Despite everything he says here, he actually left Eretz Yisrael to go live in Egypt. Now, this is a big conceptual problem. Let's see what the Kafta V'Ferech has to say about it. Now, Kafta V'Ferech was one of the few Rishonim, one of the few great medieval authorities. His name was Ishtoria Parchi. He's one of the few great Rishonim, medieval rabbis, who came to Eretz Yisrael, traveled around in Eretz Yisrael, and wrote this book we're about to quote from, which is a treatise dealing with all the mitzvot of Eretz Yisrael. Well, let's see what he has to say about the Rambam's place of residence. First, Hadar Beretz Mizraim, living in Egypt is the worst. Egypt is the pits. Like there's Chutz La'aretz is bad, Egypt is the worst of Chutz La'aretz. Anyone who lives in Mitzrayim, anyone who lives in Egypt, over Shlosha Lavim, you're guilty of 3 sins every moment that you are residing in Egypt. Shamati b'Mitzrayim, and when I was traveling through Egypt, the author of our book came from Spain. On his way to Spain, he traveled through Egypt. When I was in Egypt, I spoke with Reb Shmuel Zal, who was a descendant of the Rambam. I met this descendant of the Rambam in Egypt while I was traveling through on my way to Israel. Rambam Zal haya choteb shmo be'igeret shlucha, and this descendant of the Rambam, his name was Reb Shmuel, he told me that whenever the Rambam would sign his name at the bottom of a letter, he would sign as follows. This is how the Rambam always signed off his letters. Hakotev ha'over b'chol yom shlosha lavim. Sincerely yours, the violator of 3 commandments every day. because he was living in Mitzrayim. Now you're wondering, what are the 3 commandments that you're guilty of? What 3 commandments do you violate if you're living in Mitzrayim, in Egypt? Well, the Rambam says so himself in the Mishnah Torah. He says, Mutar lishkon b'chol ha'olam chutz me'eretz Mitzrayim. It's okay to live anywhere, assuming you have one of the justifications. One of the justifications for leaving Israel applies to the whole world, but not Egypt. Even if you have one of the 3 justifications, 4 justifications, including commerce, then it doesn't justify going to Egypt, only to the rest of the world. There are 3 psukim, the Rambam says, which prohibit residence in Egypt. Lo tosifun lashuv b'derech hazeh od. Don't go back to Egypt. After the Exodus, after Yetzias Mitzrayim, we had the commandment, don't go back. Well, if any of the Jewish people go back to live in Egypt, they're guilty of violating that verse. Next, lo tosif od lirota. You should not go. You should not see Eretz Mitzrayim again after the Yetzias Mitzrayim, after the Exodus. We're commanded not even to see Egypt again. Lo tosifun lirotam od ad olam, in a 3rd pasuk, forever and ever you should stay away from Mitzrayim. Well, there are 3 specific psukim which the Rambam himself quotes as the basis of 3 biblical prohibitions if you live in Egypt, and he lived there. And according to what Reb Shmuel said, this descendant of the Rambam, whenever he would sign a letter, he would sign, sincerely yours, in violation of 3 commandments every day. Amarti lo derech chatzi nechama. I said to Rabbi Shmuel, the descendant, to console him, Shema harav zal haya muchrach la'amod sham. Maybe Rambam had no choice. Maybe he was anus, forced to live there against his will. Shaharei haya rofei lemelech Mitzrayim. He was the royal physician. He was the physician of the Melech, Sultan, Melech, 2 words for the same concept. Rambam was the Sultan's personal physician. This is like it says in Baba Kama, Avtalos b'Reb Ruvain, Hitir lo saper komi. Among the prohibitions of the Torah is not to present yourself, not to dress and present yourself to the world like a non-Jew. For example, wearing the get-up of a Catholic priest or a nun, you're presenting yourself to the world as though you're not Jewish. That's a violation of the Chukoteim lo telechu, a prohibition of going in the ways of the Gentiles. Similarly, the Gemara says, if the non-Jews have a distinctive way of cutting their hair, well, I don't have any hair to demonstrate with, but if there's a distinctive haircut for non-Jews, and non-Jews can be identified immediately by their haircut, by the style of their hair, then of course you're not allowed to have the non-Jewish style of hair, because that's presenting yourself to the world as a non-Jew. But the Gemara says that Avtalos, any Jew who works in the royal court, any Jew who is a shtadlan, a representative of the Jewish community working in the royal court to assure the safety of the Jewish people, well, if you're working in the royal court, you're allowed to cut your hair like the non-Jews do, so you'll be able to do your job in the royal court and petition the king to do good things for the Jewish people. Maybe that's the basis of the Rambam. Since he was an employee in the royal court, he could argue with the Sultan to do things which would be beneficial for the Jewish people. So just as the Gemara says that would permit you to get a non-Jewish style haircut, maybe it also permits you to live in Egypt in order to protect the Jewish people, maybe. That's what he suggests. Let me point out in passing that historically, this is all wrong, because when the Rambam came to Egypt, after he fled Spain and traveled through North Africa, visited briefly in Eretz Yisrael, and came to Spain, came to Egypt. When the Rambam came to Egypt, he was not yet a physician. When the Rambam came to Egypt, he was in the pearl business. He was an importer and distributor of pearls in Egypt. That's how he made his livelihood. He was partnered with his brother. Rambam had a brother, and the two brothers were partners in the pearl business. The brother had the job of traveling to India to buy pearls wholesale, bring them back to Egypt, gave the pearls to his brother Rambam. Rambam had the job of selling and distributing the pearls in Egypt retail, so that those two brothers were partners in the business and they split their profits. And that is how the Rambam earned his livelihood in Egypt until there was a storm at sea. The ship with the brother coming back from India to Mitzrayim, it was in a storm. The ship sank. The brother died. The pearls were lost, and the Rambam was out of the pearl business. Since he lost his brother and his livelihood in the pearl business, he had to seek some other form of livelihood. And since he had read every medical textbook that was known in those days, he became a physician, and indeed a physician of the king. Richard Coeur de Lion, the king of England, was in those days in Eretz Yisrael. The king of England was the leader of the Crusades. Crusades were not a happy time for the Jews, but Richard Coeur de Lion, the king of England, was in Eretz Yisrael leading the Crusades, and he heard of the reputation of Rambam, the royal physician in Egypt, in the court of the Sultan. And the English king sent an invitation to Rambam, inviting him to come to London and serve as the royal physician in London. Rambam wrote back to the king, saying how honored he was to receive the invitation, but he preferred to remain in civilized Egypt rather than traveling to barbarian England in those days. In any event, that's from the biography of the Rambam. The Kafta Fair concludes, Yesh mefarshim shemash asrat Torah lashuv b'derech ze'od eino ela derech hamidbar b'yamsuf. Some people say that when the Torah prohibited going back to Mitzrayim, the Torah meant going back on the exact route that the Jews took from Mitzrayim to Eretz Yisrael. And that the Rambam didn't do. He went by ship from Akko to Alexandria. In any event, according to the Kafta Meferech, the Rambam used to sign his letters every day as someone who violated these three verses by residing in Eretz Mitzrayim. Now, historically speaking, this is a little bit difficult to accept because we have many of the letters of the Rambam. Indeed, we have around 30 pages of Rambam's writing in his own handwriting. And there's not a single example known in libraries today. There's not a single example in Rambam's writings where he actually says that he's violating 3 mitzvahs every day. And although an argument from silence is usually not of much value, this is an awful lot of silence. Since so many of the Rambam's letters are in existence, many of them in his own original handwriting, not copies. And if he had actually written that, there should be some evidence of that in archives today, but we don't have. What have we learned so far? According to the Rambam, the mitzvah of Yeshivat Eretz is a mitzvah which applies to each individual Jew, as opposed to applying to the Jewish people as a whole. And the specific rules and regulations we've gone through, the specific reasons which justify leaving Eretz Yisrael. Now, at this point, we turn to the opinion of the Ramban. He disagrees with everything we've learned up till this point. Up till this point, it was the Rambam, accent on the first syllable. Now it's the Ramban, accent on the second syllable. Hebrew, like English, is an accent-timed language. All the languages in the world divide into two categories. There are languages which are accent-timed, like English and Hebrew. There are other languages which are syllable-timed. In syllable-timed languages, every syllable gets exactly the same amount of time devoted to it. And very different from English or Hebrew, where accented syllables get a longer duration of time. And the tonality of English or Hebrew allows you to drastically change the meaning of a word just by accenting it, that is, by increasing the duration of the pronunciation of the word. Take a sentence, a simple sentence in English. Do you know where your children are? Do you know where your children are? 7 words. Do you know where your children are? Well, the meaning of the sentence can be changed dramatically depending upon the duration of the syllables as you pronounce it. Do you know where your children are? 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 Well, do you know where your children are? The English, like Hebrew, is an accent-timed language where the duration of the syllable not only is morphologically important about the structure of the word, but also carries a lot of meaning. What on earth is this interesting? Rambam the Ramban. Rambam, accent on the first syllable, Ramban, accent on the second syllable. People whose native language is syllable timed have no sense at all for these accents. For example, the French language. In French language, every syllable gets exactly the same duration of time, exactly the same accent. Native speakers of French have the greatest difficulty in hearing the difference or pronouncing the difference between two Hebrew words, ochel, he is eating, and ochel, food. Ochel is food, ochel, he is eating. Sound exactly the same, and usually pronounced exactly the same by people whose native language is syllable times, because each syllable is the same. So the Ramban distinction is a syllable timed distinction. Why on earth is all this interesting? Let's see what the Ramban has to say about all this. Now here the Ramban is commenting on the Sefer Mitzvahs. The Rambam wrote a Sefer Mitzvahs, and everything that Ramban wanted to disagree with the Rambam about. Well, the Ramban wrote this commentary on the Sefer HaMitzvahs, where he unloads all his disagreements with the Rambam. Nitztavinu l'reshet haaretz asher natan hakel yitbarach yitalel avotenu l'Avram Yitzchak v'Yaakov. We have a commandment to settle the land which God gave to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Lo na'azor b'yad zulatenu. We should never leave the land of Israel in the hands of others. Ottomans, British, Romans, whatever, Mamlukim, we should never leave Eretz Yisrael in the hands of others, and we should never let it be desolate. Now, right away, in the beginning of the Ramban's formulation, you begin to hear the underlying melody. He's not talking about your personal, individual Torah obligations. It's we as a people, it's the Jewish people as a whole who are obligated to see to it that we live in Israel. This is what it says in the verse. You, plural, shall inherit the land. You, plural, shall dwell there. Ki lachem natati. Kadosh Baruch says, I gave the land to you, plural, to Am Yisrael. And you have to inherit the earth, plural, the people in general. The mitzvah is repeated in a number of verses in the Torah. For example, again, speaking to the people as a whole, come and reside in Eretz Yisrael. The mitzvah is given to Am Yisrael as a whole, together with a specification of the borders of Eretz Yisrael. Bo'u har Emori, kol shchenav, ba'arava, b'har, b'shveifel, b'negev, b'chof hayam. Well, rabbis disagree about exactly which geographical locations this verse is referring to, but the verse does give us the halachic borders of the mitzvah of Yeshivat Eretz, which is much larger borders than the mitzvah, than the agricultural mitzvahs. Omer ani, I say, the Ramban says, ki a mitzvah shachachamim mafligim ba. This is a mitzvah which the rabbis go to great lengths to emphasize. Dirat Eretz Yisrael, residing in Israel. It goes so far as what they say in the Midrash, kol hayotzei memenu, anyone who leaves Eretz Yisrael, and lives abroad, resides abroad. Anyone who leaves Eretz Yisrael to live abroad, you should view that person as an idolater, as it says in the pasuk. The same pasuk which Rambam quoted. In addition to all of the great length that Chazal went to emphasize the importance of living in Eretz Yisrael, Hakol hu mitzvah aseh. It's a mitzvah aseh. Not only did Chazal praise living in Eretz Yisrael, not only did they say it's advisable, praiseworthy, great, but it's one of the mitzvahs. Imkaini mitzvah aseh l'darot, and it's a mitzvah through the generations. Unlike certain mitzvahs, which depend only on whether or not the Beis Hamikdash is standing. This is a mitzvah throughout all the generations. Mitchayev kol yachid memenu, every individual Jew is obligated. Afilu b'zman galut, even if you're living outside of Eretz Yisrael. And this is mentioned over and over again in the Gemara. The Sifrei says, Ma'aseh b'Rabbi Yehuda ben B'Sera, the various rabbis, when they went out of Eretz Yisrael, they were traveling to Rome. They came to the border of Eretz Yisrael, and they're about to step out of the border, leave Eretz Yisrael. They remember that they're leaving Eretz Yisrael. They raised their eyes to the heavens. And they began crying. They tore their garments. And they recited the pasuk, you must live in Eretz Yisrael. They said, Yeshivat Eretz Yisrael shkula keneged kol mitzvahs. Living in Eretz Yisrael is of great value, tantamount to fulfilling all of the mitzvahs. Here we see the machlokes. This is the big disagreement amongst the Rishonim regarding the nature of this mitzvah. The two sides of the controversy are: number one, the mitzvah applies to each individual. Number two, the mitzvah applies to Am Yisrael as a whole. But everyone agrees that it's a great mitzvah. It's hard to exaggerate how great and how important this particular mitzvah is. Now, all of this leads to a problem similar to what we mentioned earlier. Rambam lived in Egypt, and that's a big problem. What about all the Jews and their rabbis through the generations who lived outside of Israel, in North Africa, in Europe, in what do they call the New World, in America? All these places, maybe it's not as big a sin as living in Egypt, but what on earth is the justification for the rabbis through the generations living outside of Eretz Yisrael? Well, among the great rabbis who lived outside of Eretz Yisrael was the Igros Moshe Feinstein. He was born in Eastern Europe. He was a rav of a town in Eastern Europe under the back in the glorious days of Stalin, and he left the Soviet Union to go not to Eretz Yisrael, but to America. B'dvar she'elatcha, im yesh mitzvah achshav ladur be'Eretz Yisrael, that you ask me now whether Reb Moshe Feinstein is writing this. You ask me whether there's a mitzvah to live in Israel, like the Ramban says, or like Reb Chaim says in the Tosfos and on the Gemara. Ain't a mitzvah b'zman hazeh. Maybe it's not a mitzvah nowadays. Does the mitzvah apply nowadays? That's the question. Hine, behold, the Igros Moshe writes, Rov haposkim savrei du mitzvah. Most poskim think it's a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. Well, we've seen the sources. Well, pashut, but it's obvious. And you know me, I get nervous when things are so obvious that they require no proof or no source. It's obvious. She'ein zeh b'zman hazeh mitzvah chiyuvus hakol guf. It's obvious that there's no mitzvah upon each individual to go to Eretz Yisrael. It's obvious that we do not have to go live in Eretz Yisrael. He lived in New York. To Imkain, if there was such a thing as an obligation to live in Eretz Yisrael, it would be prohibited to live abroad, because you would be guilty of violating the commandment to live in Israel. Just like you're not allowed to wear a four-cornered garment without tzitzis. Well, similarly, if there were an obligation to live in Eretz Yisrael, like there's an obligation to put tzitzis on a garment, then of course you can't wear a garment without tzitzis, and you can't live in Chutz La'aretz. Well, lo huzkar isur ela aladar be'Eretz Yisrael she'asur letzet. But if you look carefully in the Rambam, all the Rambam says is that if you are already living in Eretz Yisrael, it's prohibited to leave. The Rambam never actually said that you must abandon Chutz La'aretz and go live in Eretz Yisrael. All he said is that if you are already residing in Eretz Yisrael, you need a justification to leave. There's surely no prohibition to live outside of Israel. If there were a prohibition to live outside of Israel, Rambam should have said so. He should have said something like, Asur l'shkon b'chutz la'aretz. He should have said it's prohibited to live outside of Israel if he believed there is such a thing. Ela imkein chazaka rav be'Eretz Yisrael. He should have said it's prohibited to live in Chutz La'aretz unless you have a justification. He never said that. He never said it's prohibited to live in Chutz La'aretz unless you have a. He said, if you are living in Eretz Yisrael, then you're not allowed to leave unless you have a justification. And therefore, all the Jews and their rabbis through the generations were guilty of nothing if they were living outside of Eretz Yisrael. Mashma directly Yoshvei Eretz Yisrael yesh isur she'asru chachamim. Only if you're in Israel is it prohibited to leave unless you have a justification. And surely, the Igros Moshe writes, the prohibition to leave Eretz Yisrael without one of the proper justifications is d'Rabbanan. There are no verses that talk about the various justifications to leave Eretz Yisrael. There are no verses. The prohibition to leave Eretz Yisrael, unless you have a justification, that must be d'Rabbanan. And that applies only to people who are living in Eretz Yisrael. Kevan she'ena mitzvahs chiyuvis, since there is no positive obligation to live in Israel, only a prohibition to leave. Yeshivat Simchat Shlomo. Therefore, what the Tosfos says, one must think about it very carefully. Since you're not obligated to live in Eretz Yisrael, you must think very carefully about what the Tosfos says in Ksubis. Don't go to live in Eretz Yisrael. Reb Chaim says in the Tosfos, don't go to live there unless you're sure you will be able to fulfill the mitzvot of Eretz Yisrael. Trumot, Maserot, Shmita. Why go there if you're not obligated to go there and just make more sins by failing to fulfill the mitzvot? Hatuliot ba'aretz. Well, he says a similar thing in another tshuva. Not only is there no prohibition to live outside of Israel, not only is the prohibition to leave Eretz Yisrael midrabanan, but there isn't even a rabbinic obligation to go live in Eretz Yisrael. Since there's no Torah obligation to go live in Eretz Yisrael, what sense does it make if the rabbis would institute an obligation to do so? Kayadua, everyone knows. Through the generations, since the Mishnaic period, throughout all the generations since Bayesheni, the Jews and all the rabbis have been living outside Eretz Yisrael. It cannot be that there's even a rabbinic obligation to live in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, up to this point, we've seen the main opinions of the Rishonim, the great medieval authorities. We've seen how Moshe Feinstein understands the obligation leading to his conclusion that no obligation to move to Israel. It is a mitzvah if you do so, but there's no obligation to do the mitzvah. There's a mitzvah to do so, assuming that you can properly fulfill the mitzvot hatzliot ba'aretz, which nowadays is fairly simple and straightforward. We're going to pause at this time, and next week we'll see the other side of the coin, the other opinions which disagree with this. Until then, we'll pause, and I'll ask you whether you have any questions that you want to ask at this time.
Rabbi Fink?
Yes.
Hello? Yeah?
Yes, I hear you.
Yeah. I'm sorry I missed the very beginning of it. Is one of the reasons to be able to leave Eretz Yisrael to visit family abroad?
No.
Okay.
But next week we'll see poskim who do approve of that, and we'll see why they approve of it. That'll be for next week.
Okay. All right. No, I keep telling my kids they have to come visit me because I can't go visit them. So I would be just as happy to be able to have that to back me up. But okay.
Yes, yeah. Oh, definitely. Next week we'll see those sources.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you. Yep. Bye-bye.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you very
Shalom.
much.
Yes, have a good week, a safe week.
Amen.
Shabbos, and look forward to seeing you all again next week.
Amen. Safe week.
Shalom, shalom.
Thank you as always.